Good morning. And it is time to begin talking about the season of Advent, and I look forward to that each year. As we get into it, I did want to comment just as a way of follow-up on last week's presentation, because it relates to some of the things we're going to talk about today. Last week, we talked a little bit about the status of the church, about the financial situation of the church, kind of where we're headed and so forth, and what we needed. And I hope it was abundantly clear, and if it's not, I'm going to repeat it, or if it was, I'm going to repeat it, that the problem has never been the generosity of this church. And I'll give you just three quick references to that. Here a couple of weeks ago, we told you that we were collecting funds to put together food boxes for holiday meals. You responded with over $3,000 in donations to provide at least 60 different people with a full meal this holiday season. Those are going to get distributed tonight at Restore. We were told by Elise and others that we're doing a fundraiser through this Christmas Pancakes with Santa program to raise money for the playground at CBA, and donations are welcome, participation. We had lots of volunteers. Yesterday, that event was a huge success. We doubled the number of people through the door from the previous year, and while the math is still getting mathed, somewhere between $3,000 and $3,700 was raised for the playground at CBA because of your efforts. Last week, for real. Last week, we told you that we're facing coming out of a lean year and facing another lean year. The leadership was trying to determine how much do we have to work with, how do we plan accordingly. We gave out pledge cards and asked for you to tell us, to the best of your knowledge, what you could increase for the following year. Within the first 24 hours of that initiative, we had $30,000 in pledges of increase for next year's budget. And none of it wasn't as if somebody walked up and said, here's $29,000 and hope you get the rest. All of that was in small amounts. People giving reasonable amounts and increase spread across the entire congregation to make next year's budget and ministry possible. The problem has never been the generosity of this church. Sometimes we don't communicate what we're after. Sometimes we as leaders don't provide you with the opportunity to give, but the problem has never been generosity, and God bless you all for that. Advent is, again, a season where we think about giving a lot, and we think about a lot of other things. That video, I've been familiar with the Advent Conspiracy initiative for a few years now, and then I think about it from time to time and think, I wonder if that's something other people would be interested in. This particular month, all 4 lessons through Advent are based around the themes presented in that video of what Advent is actually all about. Advent is not the same as Christmas, by the way, just to kind of keep those separate. Advent is not the same as Christmas. We like the Christmas part where we get to open presents, right? And so we tend to kind of rush it and go right to Christmas. Advent is a lot about waiting. Advent is about waiting. I don't have to be nerdy today and tell you what Advent means, because Sydney already did it for us in believable fashion. Everybody liked that? That was great. Well, Jack, Advent comes from a Latin word. And I thought, wow, looky there, that was great. I enjoyed that part of today's little devotional. And she's correct. Advent is from a Latin word, which means the arrival of a notable person, thing, or event. It's built into the traditional Christian calendar to be a time to highlight the arrival of God, both the first and the second. The hope that Christians have that God would come, that He did come, and that He's coming again. To understand the significance of that concept and of its importance and urgency in Christian life, we can look back a little bit at the Old Testament and see the eagerness they had for the arrival of God. This was from today's call to worship reading. It comes from Isaiah 64, verses 1 through 2. Oh, that you would rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at your presence, to make your name known to your adversaries, and that the nations might tremble at your presence. What was the desire there? What was the longing? What was the hope? There was an understanding that God lives in His place that we call heaven, and we live in our place that we call earth, and that for most average days there seems to be a little gap between the two. that he seems to us distant. We pray to him, we worship him, we believe he is active and working in the world, but in terms of the practical, everyday experience, I don't interact with God the same way I interact with my wife and children, my neighbors, that he seems to be a little bit removed. And always when you read the Old Testament, there was this hesitant desire that God would bridge the gap and come down to our place. I say a hesitant desire because as much as they wanted God to invade their everyday life, to come from his place to ours, for heaven and earth to be one and for him to dwell with us, there was also an understanding that that might be scary. One thing the ancient person had that we probably lack at times is a better appreciation of what it might mean for God to just show up. We have a tendency to be very nonchalant about the presence of God and what that might entail. But the ancient person understood and was a little bit frightened by the idea of an infinite creator, infinite in power, infinite in wisdom, infinite in might, infinite in glory, breaking through the sky, ripping the roof off the world, and coming down to live among us might be a little bit frightening. At Mount Sinai, God came down to Israel and met Moses at the top of the mountain. And it says the mountain burned and the heavens shook, the mountain quaked, and people were afraid. What were they afraid of? God was at the top of the mountain. So they wanted God to come down. But there was a little bit of hesitance, a reluctance, because they realized it was at least possible that while we want him to come for a visit, we weren't entirely sure we're ready for it. What if he gets here and we're not ready? There's something we understand in Advent season because we spend a lot of time getting ready for people to come and visit us. Saw something on Facebook the other day that I thought was funny. The degree of our friendship is how did it say it? The degree of the depth of our friendship is reflected in how much time I spend when you come to my house cleaning up. Like if we're not that good of friends, I really clean up the house. If we're really good friends, you know what my house looks like and you just come on over. I'm like, yeah, whatever, it's a mess. I don't even apologize anymore, right? We spend a lot of time with company coming over trying to get things ready. I don't know why. I mean, it's something ingrained in us from early years, that this fear that our company's going to show up and they're going to have a white glove and they're going to check the baseboards to see if there's dust or something like that. They're going to go through our closets and make sure the laundry's done. Hasn't happened to me yet, but we fear that. People come for a visit and then they might judge us or they might think less of us when they arrive. We want everything to be just right. That's such a minor and trivial concern. But when it comes to God, you can feel that palpably, especially in the Old Testament. God was going to arrive, and then he was going to look at this world that he made, the people that he put in it, and the responsibilities that he gave us, and he might be disappointed in what he found. We want God to come for a visit. We're not entirely sure we're ready. Isaiah continued with these words, "When you did awesome things that we did not look for, you came down, the mountains quaked at your presence. From of old, no one has heard or perceived by the ear, no eye has seen a God besides you, who acts for those who wait for him." There was an understanding that God would come down, that God would arrive. And not only are we not sure that we're ready, there was an understanding that we absolutely wouldn't be forewarned. That God was not going to clue us in ahead of time. That this is the nature of God. God does not ask our permission to invade our world and invade our lives and to be who he is. He just shows up. No eye has seen, no ear has heard. God just does what he does. Something about that we ought to remember. A lot of time and energy is spent in some circles in Christianity trying to anticipate when God's going to show up. And the prophets of the Old Testament who knew God best said, that's just not how you do it, is it? You just show up. And so there was this concern. They very much wanted God to come down. But ready or not, God's arrival was going to be a surprise. They believed that in Isaiah. And we've got to understand that that's what we have to believe today. God just shows up. In small ways, in big ways, God just shows up. And it's up to us then to live accordingly. Now that's in reference, when you're reading Isaiah, to what we might call the first advent. There was a desire for the arrival of God. And that advent, the first arrival of God, came to fruition. It really did happen. And just as Isaiah feared, we were entirely unprepared. We weren't ready. God showed up after millennia of warning, and we weren't ready for his arrival. I've told you before, I kind of map out a general idea of my sermons about a year in advance, and actually each year even has a gospel assigned to it. This coming year is a Mark year, so just get prepared. There's going to be lots of Mark. And Mark starts in an interesting way. It's hard to talk about Christmas when you're preaching out of Mark, because Mark just doesn't talk about Christmas, right? When Mark's gospel begins, Mark chapter 1, verse 1, you start with Jesus, full-grown adult. Right there. Skips the whole story that Matthew and Luke tells, jumps right into Jesus as an adult, because part of Mark's point was the abrupt, surprising arrival of God. He just showed up one day, and we weren't ready. Here's verse 9 for the example. In those days, Jesus came from Nazareth of Galilee and was baptized by John in the Jordan. And when he came out of the water, immediately he saw, and notice this phrase, the heavens being torn open and the Spirit descending on him like a dove. And a voice came from heaven, "You are my Son, my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Don't miss the very direct connection between that verse and what we read in Isaiah 64. In Isaiah 64, the prophet said, "Oh, that you would tear open the heavens and come down. We'd love to have you come for a visit." And he used that phrase, "Oh, that you would tear open the heavens," that God's in his place and we're in ours, and there's this little veil between, and we wish God would just pull the wrapping paper off and come on down to our place. And Mark says, well, there was a day one time when Jesus arrived at Jordan, and he went into the water and was baptized, and as he came back out, God ripped open the sky and descended as a dove, and then, in case we weren't sure what was going on, he shouted at us, "This is what I'm doing. That's my Son. I have arrived." Okay. Without really any warning that we listened to, at least, God simply arrived, just as he said he would, abruptly, surprisingly. He ripped open the sky and he said, "Here I am." And he pointed at Jesus Christ. God did come for a visit, and sure enough, no one was ready. There's a certain amount of smugness that comes with being a Christian when you read the New Testament. It happens to us that when we read the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, we always look at the people who met Jesus and say, why couldn't they just figure it out? I mean, they were told, the prophet said he'd be born in Bethlehem. Why wasn't there like a guy waiting in Bethlehem to let people know he'd be there? The prophet said he'd be born of a virgin. Why didn't they see this coming? The prophet said this would happen. Why didn't they see it coming? And we'd have this smugness as if, if we were there, we would have been really well prepared. But of course, that's not the point of the story. People just like us were there. They had been warned. They had been told it's going to happen. God quite literally ripped the sky open and shouted, "This is him. I'm here." And still, when you read the Gospels, nobody was ready. Jesus did miracles and they didn't know how to respond. Jesus taught his message and people didn't know how to hear it. And if you want to be a serious Christian, you have to read those stories and realize you would have been exactly the same. And that in the years since, not only that, we have it done much better. Jesus, in the book of Mark, makes exactly this point. Mark chapter 1 said God ripped the sky open and he came down and nobody was ready. In Mark the 13th chapter, Mark says, "But concerning that day or that hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father." He says, God will return again. Have you learned anything? You weren't ready when I came the first time. Prophets announced it. John the Baptist prepared you. You weren't ready. He says, I'm coming again. Got news for you. You're probably not going to be any more prepared. Be on guard. Keep awake, he says in the following verses. For you do not know when the time will come. It is like a man going on a journey. When he leaves home and puts his servant in charge, each with his work, and commands the doorkeeper to stay awake. It is not for lack of warning. I told you I'm leaving. I told you I'm coming back. I told you what you're supposed to be doing while I'm gone. He says, you know how this is supposed to go, but you also know exactly how it's going to go. He says, you're not going to be ready. Therefore, stay awake. For you do not know when the master of the house will come, in the evening, or at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. And what I say to all, stay awake. Did you get that last bit? As if he's shouting down through the centuries, not just to the people of his time, not just to the people in the next century and the century after that, for all of Christians, for all of time, for all people that on the earth do dwell, Jesus has the same message. I came once, you weren't ready, I'm coming again. What I say to you all, stay awake. So the question I think we want to get to is then how can we do that? What Christians have in principle learned, if we've learned anything from the prophets of the Old Testament, if we've learned anything from the message of the Gospels, if we've learned anything from the way it's repeated in the epistles and letters that follow, it's that we're going to have to do better this time around. Christians learn to live in constant readiness for the arrival of God. Rather than being afraid, well, I hope he doesn't catch me off guard, rather than trying to anticipate it, to read the signs and seasons and tea leaves and try to understand maybe, if I can cheat the system a little bit and get ahead of it, if I could know when he's going to get here, I could be extra ready. Not the way we do it. Christians just say, the first time we weren't ready, we're not going to do that again. We're going to live every day with a kind of vigil, a readiness, a preparedness, so that when God rips open the sky and comes again, we find ourselves happy to see him. You know the difference, right? Christmas time is coming. Guests are coming. Who here enjoys a surprise visit from relatives? When they just show up at the door. Yeah. Where were all the hands up? Nobody likes that. I don't even like it when you're early. Right? If I say, hey, we're going to get together, we're going to have dinner at 5, you guys can start showing up around 4:30. You get there at 4, my glare is on full display. I'm not ready yet, right? You understand that. God is going to arrive. He's not telling us when. If I'm not ready when he arrives, I'm also not going to be very happy. I see his arrival as threatening. Oh, I wasn't ready yet. I need more time. But if I'm ready when he comes, it's a delight. I've had a moment to sit and rest and reflect and say, yes, this is what I've eagerly waited for, and I am prepared. Christians, therefore, learn to live in constant readiness for the arrival of God. So what we want to do over the next couple of weeks then is ask ourselves the question, how do we do that? And in particular, to make it very concrete, at this time of year, let's just admit, Christmas is coming. And the last thing on any of our minds is the second coming of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of the dead, right? That's just not at the top of our list. We got a to-do list. I have a very lengthy to-do list. And on it, nowhere appears the words, prepare for the trumpet of the Lord. Right? There's a lot of things about wrapping paper and stockings, but not a lot about Jesus. How do I better prepare myself each and every day, especially at this time of year when everything is competing for my attention, to learn from the first coming of Christ, to prepare myself for the second? And the nice people at the Advent Conspiracy Initiative have kind of put together this list that if we remembered these 4 things, 4 weeks of Advent, 4 things to remember, if you remembered these 4 things, you'd be off to a really good start. And we're going to take one a week and talk about it. And today we want to emphasize the idea of worshiping fully. One of the ways Christians prepare themselves for the coming of God is to be a worshiping people. In worship, we step into the presence of God now. When we worship, we are on the outskirts of heaven. We are on the fringes of His presence. That veil that separates us from Him gets thinner, and we draw nearer to Him. The more time we spend in that place, nearer to the presence of God, fully entering His presence, the more prepared we are for His arrival in full. The Christmas story actually reminds us that when God comes, that's something you want to be doing. When people did, remember, not everybody was completely surprised. In the story of the birth of Jesus, there are a few people who are actually ready. We have a name for them. We call them the wise men. And it's a good name. We don't know any of their backstory. I would read that novel. I want to know where they come from. I want to know who they were. I want to know how they arrived at their conclusion. But what the text tells us, that there were some men from the east who were waiting and preparing. And somehow, some way, by a gift of God, they got a hint that He was on His way. And they formed their little caravan and paraded across the land, and they came to the city of Jerusalem. And they come to Herod, and they say, "Hey, we're here. Where is He?" And of course, Herod, one of those people decidedly not prepared for the coming of Jesus, says, "I have no idea what you're talking about." People go consult the books. They say, "Well, there's a reference over here in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2 that He'll be born in Bethlehem. I suppose you could try there. Let me know how that goes." And off they go. These guys are actually ready. And you know what they do when they get there? What do people do who are ready for the coming of God? Here's the text. "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, 'Where is He who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw His star when it rose and have come to worship Him.'" What's their plan? God is just almost here. I don't know how they know it. They reference a star. If you can I have a degree in stars. That's my thing, right? Astronomy, astrophysics. I have no idea what this verse is about, right? They said, "We saw a thing. Somehow we knew what it meant. And lo and behold, they were right. And we're here." And what do they want to do? What's their mission? To go where God is and worship Him because He has arrived. And you know what they do when they get there? They do go to Bethlehem. Verse 9, "After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary, His mother, and they fell down and worshiped Him. Then opening their treasures, they offered Him their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh." The part of the story we remember is the gold, frankincense, and myrrh because they're funny words and they're fun to say and it's easy to remember. There were 3 gifts and so forth. But those are just explanations of what they were really there to do. They told Herod why they were there. The narrator of Matthew says why they were there. They had come for one purpose. They said, "We know," I don't know how they know, but they knew that God was arriving this day, and they wanted to be there to do one thing, to worship Him. How do you prepare yourself for the arrival of God? We worship. We enter into the presence of God fully. But I'm not a wise man. I don't have a magic clock that tells me when He's going to show up. So what do Christians do? We worship over and over and over again. And that worship is preparation and entry into the presence of God in anticipation of His arrival. Listen to what Paul says, for example, referencing communion in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. In verse 26, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until He comes." Until He comes. What's the message of communion? We are here, worshiping You, entering into Your presence, partaking of Your body and blood. We are entering into You every day until You get here, because we know You're coming back. How do we prepare ourselves? You want to spend time at this time of year preparing yourselves not for your to-do list, but for the coming of your Lord. Learn a lesson from the first arrival. Learn a lesson from the wise men, rightly so called. We want to be worshiping when he comes. Man, if I had to pick, if I could get out my calendar and say, Lord, I'd like you to come at this particular time, right? What would you pick? Wouldn't it be something if we're in the middle of a chorus of Joy to the World and that's when he shows up? I could be pretty good with that. When I'm being selfish and doing other things and he shows up, I'm going to be a little embarrassed. But if he were to show up in the middle of Joy to the World, I could get on board with that, right? I would feel prepared more than at any other moment in my life because I was doing exactly what I was supposed to be doing when he arrives. I was worshiping my God. Be a people of worship. Worship him in your home. Worship him in your devotion. Worship him in your closet. Worship him with your family. Worship him with your church. Be a people of worship. And when he comes, you'll be ready. Our Father and our God, we thank you for the promise you have made. We thank you that you have come and that you will come again. We thank you for your arrival, for the advent of your Son, and we eagerly await your return. Please this day accept our worship and help us to be a worshiping people. Help us to be a people who are focused on you, giving you the glory and praise that you deserve in every season and every time of our lives until you come. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.